Hello, I'm Casey Welch, and we're continuing the discussion of John Fuller and my book, American Criminal Courts, Legal Process and Social Context. In this chapter and video, which is actually the heart of the book, we discuss the many variables, and not just the law, that influence legal decision-making and actions among lawyers and judges. In the United States, there are 800,000 lawyers and 60,000 judges. If we look behind the image of rational law, we see that there's a great deal of variance in their decision-making, and there's also a large array of variables that influence their behaviors. This includes legal principles and legal reasoning, internal ecology variables, and external ecology variables. These were introduced in the Chapter 1 video, and I'll just summarize them here. When we refer to legal principles, we're talking about the broad principles like due process and rule of law, but also specific principles like precedent or the presumption of innocence. When we refer to legal reasoning, this is the regiment that a lawyer has to go through to connect the facts of a particular case to the actual wording of a law. And it's a very disciplined process. When we refer to the internal ecology variables, we're talking about variables that are not legal variables, but nonetheless influence how lawyers and judges handle cases. For instance, the office policies and priorities, or the resources that are available. Are there interpreters available? And then finally, the local legal culture of the courtroom work group. For instance, are the attorneys, the defense attorney and prosecuting attorney, are they cooperative or do they have a more adversarial relationship? The third set of variables are the external ecology variables. And these are ones that people often overlook because of that myth of the rational law. But they have a tremendous influence. There are things like the attitudes of the voting public, the legislative lawmaking powers and funding powers, science and pseudoscience that influences the courts, and then the media and activist groups or social movements. That is the sets of variables that influence decision-making. But let's look at one issue with regards to how lawyers and judges make decisions, and that's the issue of race in the courts in the United States. There are people in the United States who argue that we are beyond race, that we're in the post-racial society, that race no longer matters. And it is true that in 1964, Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, and that officially eliminated what were called Jim Crow laws, laws that specifically limited the behaviors of blacks and other minorities in public facilities, education, and even in public space. And the country has made tremendous progress since that law was signed. There are no longer, for instance, reckless eye laws that actually criminalize a black man looking at a white woman in a public space. And research also indicates, when looking at race in the courts, that race is not the major variable that influences the decision-making of the lawyers and judges. The major variable is the evidence. Nonetheless, research also indicates that there are non-legal influences, including race, that do impact the decision-making. Volumes of research find that race does have a slight effect on decision-making and court outcomes. And I want to go over just some of this research, a few examples. One, in areas or communities where there is a high fear of minorities, and that's called the minority threat fear, there has been a decrease in recent decades in funding to public defenders. And given that blacks are disproportionately within the criminal justice system and disproportionately low income, that means that blacks are now receiving disproportionately lower quality defense. Public defenders also tend to, not all public defenders, but they tend to give less vigorous defense to blacks and other minorities. Minorities also receive more often preventive detention and higher bonds when going to a bail hearing. Minorities will less often receive diversion or intermediate sentences. And in areas where judges have a law and order platform, elected judges have a law and order platform, their harsh sentences, including execution, tend to fall more heavily on blacks than on white defendants. This doesn't even take into account the race disparities in policing, in arrests, in probation assignment and revocation, treatment in prisons, and parole decisions. But let's look just at the court and the racial effect in the court. And let's look at this cumulative effect of slight disparities through the logic of natural selection. And we can see that there is what we call a social selection of discrimination, where small discriminatory practices and outcomes will have a profound multiplier effect over time on the individual, communities, and the entire nation. Let's just take the 1 million felony convictions a year, every year in the United States, holding to the side all the misdemeanor convictions and all the people who were not convicted but were diverted out. The 1 million felony convictions. Nearly 40% of those, or 400,000, are black defendants. If there is only a 1% race effect in that conviction tally, and research actually indicates that it very well might be greater than 1%. But if there's only a 1% race effect, that means that every year in the United States, 4,000 blacks receive a criminal record or receive harsher court-ordered punishment because of their race. Over a 20-year period of time, just one generation, that's approximately 80,000 blacks who are disadvantaged by the U.S. system of justice, children and families of 80,000 blacks who suffer, and neighborhoods of 80,000 blacks that are weakened. Consider the fallout this can have for communities in a nation. And this is a long list I'm about to provide, but it's very relevant to think about the real effects of race in the courts in the United States. These defendants will spend more time in prison and more time away from the home. They will have difficulty finding housing after release. They will have difficulty finding employment and have exclusion from some jobs. There are no laws protecting people or preventing discrimination against criminal records. There will be a decrease in income, denial of welfare assistance, damaged credit, loss of rights like voting and gun ownership, increased police surveillance and questioning, family discord, mental and physical health problems, decreased self-esteem and self-efficacy, stigmatization of the children. And think about having to go to school every day where all your classmates and your teachers know that your dad and or your mother are ex-cons. Greater rates of poverty in the community, reduced influence of positive role models, increased prejudicial attitude and fear of a minority threat, and so on. And the children of these families, what effect is it going to have on them, their self-esteem, as well as their likelihood of committing delinquency as they get older? And a final thing to think about is to consider that the race effect very well likely might be greater than 1%. I appreciate your joining us for this video and this discussion of the influences on legal decision making, as well as the sometimes tense issue of race in the criminal justice system. In the next video, we're actually going to discuss the process that lawyers go through in preparing for a trial. Thank you again.